The sun rose over the valley each morning in ancient times. Light spread across the hills and touched the walls of structures. People woke when the light came through openings in their shelters. They moved from sleeping areas to other parts of their dwellings. The air was cool in the early hours before the sun climbed higher. Feet touched packed earth floors that had been smoothed by years of use. Water needed to be carried from the river or the well each day. Containers made of clay or leather were used to transport the water back. The path to the water source was worn into the ground from use. People walked this path many times throughout their lives without much thought. The water was poured into larger vessels kept inside the dwelling for daily needs. Grain had been stored in large jars from the previous harvest season. Some of this grain was removed each day to be prepared for eating. The grain was ground between two stones to make it into smaller pieces. This grinding took time and required steady pressure from the hands and arms. The resulting powder was mixed with water to form a basic mixture for cooking. Fire pits were located in central areas of the dwelling or outside nearby. Fuel for these fires came from dried branches and other plant materials gathered regularly. The fire was started using methods that had been learned and repeated many times. Heat from the fire was used to cook the grain mixture and other foods. Smoke rose from the fire and drifted out through openings or doorways in structures. Clothing was made from materials that came from plants or animals in the region. These garments were simple in their construction and served basic protective functions against weather. The same pieces of clothing were worn repeatedly until they needed repair or replacement. Damaged areas were mended using basic tools and additional material when it was available. Animals were kept near human dwellings for various practical purposes over long periods. These animals required daily attention, including provision of food and water from nearby sources. Their enclosures needed to be maintained to keep them in designated areas throughout each day. Waste from the animals was removed regularly and placed in specific locations away from living spaces. The ground around dwellings was swept or cleared of debris as part of routine maintenance. Tools for this work were made from wood and other materials found in the environment. The same tasks were performed day after day in roughly the same sequence by habit. People moved through these actions without needing to plan each step in advance every time. Children were present in these spaces and learned tasks by watching older people perform them. They began helping with simple parts of larger tasks as they grew in size. Their participation in daily work increased gradually over the years of their childhood and youth. The methods they learned were the same methods that had been used for generations before. Grain needed to be checked regularly to ensure it remained dry and usable. Containers were opened and the contents were examined by hand and by sight. Any signs of moisture or damage were noted and the grain was moved if needed. The lids were replaced and sealed again to keep insects and rodents away from stores. This checking happened at intervals throughout each week without specific ceremony or significance attached to it. Grinding stones required cleaning after each use to remove residue from previous grinding sessions. Water was poured over the surfaces and the stones were rubbed with rougher materials. The grinding surface wore down slowly over months and years of repeated daily use. Eventually, stones needed to be replaced when the surface became too smooth to work effectively. New stones were selected from riverbanks or hillsides and carried back to the dwelling for use. Flour made from grinding was stored in smaller containers for easier access during meal preparation. These containers sat near the cooking area where they could be reached without extra movement. The same containers were refilled from larger storage vessels when they became empty through daily use. Lids or coverings kept dust and insects out of the flour between uses throughout the day. Dough was formed by mixing flour with water in proportions learned through long practice and observation. Hands worked the mixture until it reached a familiar consistency that required no measurement or thought. The dough was shaped into flat rounds or other simple forms that cooked evenly over fire. These shapes were placed on hot stones or directly in ashes to cook through completely. Cooking time was judged by appearance and by the passage of time estimated from experience. The rounds were turned once during cooking to ensure both sides received heat from the fire below. When cooked through, they were removed from heat and placed on flat surfaces to cool briefly. The same process was repeated multiple times each day to provide food for all people in household. Water for cooking was kept in vessels near the fire area for convenient access during preparation. Additional water was added to pots when cooking grains or other foods that absorbed liquid during heating. The water level in storage vessels decreased throughout the day and needed replenishment from outside sources. Someone made trips to carry water back as needed to maintain supply for ongoing needs. Pots made of clay were used for cooking foods that needed to be boiled in water. These pots sat directly on coals or were suspended over flames using simple supports made of stone. The clay darkened over time from repeated exposure to smoke and heat from many fires. Cracks sometimes formed in the clay and were repaired with mixtures that hardened when heated again. Foods other than grain were prepared using similar methods with minor variations in specific steps taken. Vegetables were washed in water to remove soil before being cut into smaller pieces for cooking. Cutting was done using sharp stones or metal blades depending on what materials were available locally. The pieces were added to pots with water and cooked until soft enough to eat easily. Herbs and plants were gathered from areas around the dwelling where they grew naturally each season. These plants were recognized by their appearance and were collected when they reached suitable stages of growth. They were added to cooking pots in small amounts to provide flavor to otherwise plain preparations. Dried herbs from previous gathering were stored in small pouches or wrapped bundles for later use. Meals were eaten at times that corresponded roughly to the position of the sun in sky. Morning meals happened after initial tasks of the day had been started or completed by household members. Midday meals were smaller and often consisted of foods prepared earlier that same morning or previous evening. Evening meals were prepared as daylight began to decrease and people returned from working in fields or other locations. Eating was done using hands or simple utensils made from wood or other easily shaped materials available. Food was taken from shared vessels placed in central locations where people sat together during mealtimes. The same vessels were used day after day until they broke or wore out from handling. Broken vessels were replaced with new ones made using the same techniques as before without notable changes. Cleaning of cooking vessels and eating utensils happened after each meal was finished by remaining household members. Water was used to rinse away food residue and the items were dried using cloth or air. Clean vessels were returned to their usual storage locations until needed again for the next meal preparation. This pattern repeated itself 3 times each day throughout all seasons of the year without variation. Scraps from food preparation were collected and either fed to animals or discarded in designated areas outside. These areas were located away from the dwelling to prevent attraction of scavenging animals or insects to living spaces. The same disposal locations were used repeatedly until they filled and new locations were established nearby. Old disposal areas gradually became covered with soil and plant growth over longer periods of time. Fire pits accumulated ash from burned fuel that needed removal periodically to maintain efficient burning conditions. Ash was scooped out using flat implements and carried to disposal areas or spread on gardens. The pit was left empty briefly before new fuel was added and fire was restarted for next use. This maintenance happened every few days depending on how much the fire had been used recently. Fuel supplies were monitored to ensure sufficient material remained available for daily fire needs without interruption. When supplies decreased to certain levels, someone gathered more wood from surrounding areas where it could be found. Dried branches were preferred because they burned more easily and produced less smoke than green wood. Bundles of fuel were carried back and stacked near the dwelling for convenient access when needed. Gathering fuel took place during daylight hours when visibility made selection of suitable pieces easier to accomplish. The same areas were visited repeatedly over time until available wood became scarce in those locations. New gathering areas were identified and used when previous sources had been depleted through regular collection. The distance traveled to gather fuel increased gradually as nearby sources were exhausted over months and years. Stored fuel was kept dry by placing it under covered areas or inside portions of dwellings. Wet wood did not burn well and produced excessive smoke that caused discomfort during cooking and heating. Fuel was allowed to dry further after gathering if it had been collected during damp weather. The driest pieces were selected first for use while damper pieces dried in storage areas. Kindling materials were kept separate from larger fuel pieces for use in starting new fires each day. These small dry twigs and plant fibers caught flame more easily than thick branches or logs. A small amount of kindling was arranged in the fire pit before larger pieces were added. The fire grew from the burning kindling and eventually provided enough heat to ignite the larger fuel. Starting fires required methods that had been learned through observation and practice over long periods of time. Friction or striking materials together produced heat that ignited the prepared kindling in the fire pit. This process took time and required patience and steady repetitive motions to generate sufficient heat for ignition. Once started, the fire was maintained throughout the day by adding fuel as needed periodically. Smoke from fires moved upward and exited through openings in roofs or through doorways left open for this purpose. The amount of smoke depended on the type of fuel being burned and how dry it was. Dense smoke indicated wet fuel or insufficient airflow in the fire pit area during burning. Adjustments were made by repositioning fuel or changing the arrangement of burning pieces to improve combustion. Heat from fires warmed the interior spaces of dwellings during colder parts of the year when needed. People sat near fires during evening hours after outdoor work had ended for the day. The same positions around the fire were occupied by the same individuals most evenings without deliberate arrangement. Children sat closer to adults who monitored the fire and prevented accidental contact with flames or coals. Coals from fires remained hot long after flames had diminished and were used for extended cooking tasks. Food could be placed directly on coals or in vessels set among them for slow, even heating. Coals were also moved to other locations using metal or stone implements for starting fires elsewhere. Eventually, coals cooled completely and became part of the ash that accumulated in fire pits over time. Clothing required regular inspection to identify areas where fabric had worn thin or developed holes from use. These damaged sections were examined to determine whether repair was possible or replacement was necessary for continued function. Thread made from plant fibers or animal materials was used to stitch torn areas back together when possible. Needles made from bone or metal were pushed through fabric repeatedly to complete repairs that extended garment usability. Washing of clothing happened at intervals determined by visible soiling or by the passage of certain amounts of time. Garments were taken to water sources or water was brought to washing areas near the dwelling. The fabric was submerged in water and rubbed against itself or against stones to loosen dirt embedded in fibers. Multiple rounds of rinsing removed soap or cleaning agents along with loosened soil from the washing process. Drying of washed clothing took place in open air where sun and wind removed moisture from fabric. Garments were draped over bushes or ropes or laid flat on clean ground surfaces in direct sunlight. The drying time varied depending on weather conditions and the thickness of the fabric being dried. Once dry, the clothing was collected and returned to storage areas or put back into regular use. Storage of clothing when not being worn involved folding or hanging garments in designated areas of the dwelling. Insects that damaged fabric were kept away by using certain dried plants placed among stored items. The same storage locations were used consistently so garments could be found easily when needed again. Seasonal clothing was stored for long periods between times when weather made its use appropriate or necessary. Footwear made from leather or woven plant materials protected feet from rough ground and temperature extremes during movement. These items wore out more quickly than other clothing due to constant contact with abrasive surfaces. Repairs to footwear involved adding new layers of material to worn areas or replacing entire sections that failed. New footwear was made when repairs were no longer effective at maintaining the protective function required. Hair required regular attention to prevent tangling and to remove dirt accumulated during daily activities outdoors. Combs made from wood or bone were pulled through hair repeatedly to separate and straighten individual strands. Water was used to wet hair before combing when tangles were particularly difficult to remove by other means. Cut hair was collected and disposed of in the same areas used for other household waste materials. Sleeping areas were maintained by smoothing fabric or plant materials used as bedding between periods of use. These materials were taken outside periodically and shaken to remove dust and debris that accumulated during sleep. Sunlight and air helped reduce moisture and odors that developed in bedding over time with repeated use. Worn bedding materials were replaced when they no longer provided adequate comfort or cleanliness for continued use. Floors of dwellings were swept using bundles of stiff plant materials bound together to form basic brooms. Sweeping moved loose dirt and debris toward doorways where it could be pushed outside the structure. This task was performed daily or every few days depending on how much dirt accumulated from foot traffic. Hard-packed earth floors developed shallow depressions over time from repeated foot traffic in commonly used pathways through rooms. Walls of structures required periodic inspection for damage from weather or from animals seeking entry to shelters. Cracks or holes were filled with mud or other materials that dried to form solid barriers again. The same repairs were needed repeatedly in areas where walls received more exposure to wind or rain. Maintenance prevented larger structural problems from developing over longer periods of time through regular small interventions. Roofs needed attention to ensure they continued to shed rain and provide protection from sun and wind. Materials used for roofing included bundles of dried plants or wooden pieces arranged to overlap and direct water downward. These materials degraded over time from exposure to weather and required replacement in sections as they failed. Roof maintenance happened during dry seasons when work could be completed without interference from rain or snow. Thatch or other roofing materials were gathered from areas where appropriate plants grew in sufficient quantities for harvest. Bundles were prepared by cutting plants to similar lengths and tying them together for easier handling during installation. The bundles were carried to the dwelling and stored until needed for repairs or for construction of new structures. Proper drying of materials before installation improved their durability and resistance to decay over time and place. Tools used for construction and maintenance were stored in specific locations where they remained protected from weather when idle. Wooden handles on tools dried out and cracked if left in direct sun for extended periods. Metal parts required occasional application of fat or oil to prevent rust from forming on surfaces exposed to moisture. Tool maintenance ensured implements remained functional for the next time they were needed for work tasks. Sharpening of cutting tools happened regularly to maintain their effectiveness for various tasks around the dwelling and fields. Stones with abrasive surfaces were rubbed against blade edges repeatedly until sharpness was restored to useful levels. The angle and pressure used during sharpening had been learned through practice over time and required little conscious thought. Dull tools made work slower and more difficult, so maintenance was part of routine preparations for tasks. Rope and cordage were made from plant fibers twisted together to create length strong enough for various uses. These materials were used to bind objects together or to suspend items from structural supports in dwellings. Rope wore out from friction and from exposure to moisture and needed replacement when it became too weak. New rope was made as needed using the same techniques that had been used for previous generations. Baskets woven from flexible plant materials served as containers for carrying and storing various items around the dwelling. The weaving pattern created openings small enough to contain most objects while allowing air circulation for certain stored goods. Baskets developed where in areas that received the most handling and these weak points were reinforced when possible. Broken baskets were dismantled and the materials were sometimes reused in construction of new baskets or other objects. Clay vessels required careful handling to prevent breakage from impacts or from thermal shock during heating and cooling. Broken pieces could sometimes be fitted back together and sealed with mixtures that hardened to restore functionality. Vessels that broke into too many pieces were discarded and new ones were formed from clay when needed. Making new vessels involved collecting clay from known deposits and working it into desired shapes before drying and firing. Firing of clay vessels happened in hot fires that changed the physical properties of the clay permanently through heating. The vessels were placed in or near very hot coals and left for periods of time sufficient for complete firing. Improper firing resulted in weak vessels that cracked or broke easily during later use, so care was taken. Successfully fired vessels were allowed to cool slowly before being put into service for cooking or storage purposes. Oil and fat from animals were collected and stored for use in cooking and for other purposes. These materials were kept in sealed containers to prevent spoilage from exposure to air over extended time periods. Small amounts were removed as needed for adding to cooking or for treating leather and wooden objects. Rancid fat was discarded when it developed unpleasant odors that indicated it was no longer suitable for use. Leather required treatment with oils and other materials to keep it flexible and resistant to water damage. Animal hides were processed through multiple steps that removed hair and other tissues before tanning could begin. Tanning involved applying plant materials or other substances that chemically altered the hide to prevent decay and stiffening. The processed leather was used for making various items including clothing and containers and straps for different purposes. Hides were stretched on frames to dry after initial cleaning removed flesh and fat from inner surfaces. Scraping tools were used repeatedly across the surface to remove remaining tissue that would cause decay if left. The stretched hide remained on the frame for days while drying progressed to appropriate levels for next steps. Periodic checking ensured drying was even across the entire surface area of the hide being processed. Tanning agents were prepared from bark or other plant parts collected and stored for this specific purpose only. These materials were ground or crushed and then mixed with water to create solutions of appropriate strength. The prepared hide was submerged in tanning solution for extended periods measured in days or weeks sometimes. The solution penetrated the hide gradually and altered its structure through chemical processes that occurred without visible change. Fields near dwellings were worked throughout growing seasons to produce grain and other foods for later use. The soil was turned using tools made of wood or metal that broke up compacted earth from previous seasons. This turning happened before seeds were planted and required repeated passes across the same ground to achieve suitable results. The physical effort of turning soil was divided among people capable of performing the work over multiple days. Seeds saved from previous harvests were kept in dry storage until planting time arrived each year. These seeds were examined before planting to remove any that showed signs of damage or decay that prevented growth. The viable seeds were distributed across prepared fields in patterns that allowed each plant adequate space for growth. Covering the seeds with soil after distribution protected them from birds and other animals that consumed exposed seeds. Watering of planted fields happened through natural rainfall or through manual carrying of water to growing plants. In areas where rainfall was insufficient, someone transported water from rivers or wells to field locations regularly. The amount of water needed increased as plants grew larger and developed more extensive root systems underground. Dry periods required more frequent watering to maintain plant health and prevent crop failure from insufficient moisture. Weeds grew among planted crops and competed for water and soil nutrients needed by desired plants. These unwanted plants were removed by hand or with tools that cut them below soil surface level. Removal happened repeatedly throughout the growing season as new weeds sprouted from seeds or from roots remaining underground. The pulled weeds were left on the ground to dry or were collected for animal feed depending on type. Plants grew taller over weeks and months following predictable patterns observed in previous growing seasons without variation. The same types of plants reached similar heights and produced similar amounts of grain or other food each year. Changes in weather affected growth rates and final yields, but the basic progression remained consistent across generations. People checked fields regularly to monitor plant health and to identify any problems requiring attention or intervention. Insects and other small creatures sometimes damaged growing crops by eating leaves or stems or developing seeds. Certain insects were removed by hand when found on plants during inspections of the field areas. Birds were discouraged from eating seeds or grain by using noise or by placing objects in fields that moved. The extent of damage varied from season to season, but some loss to these causes was expected normally. Harvesting began when plants reached full maturity and seeds had dried to appropriate levels for storage purposes. Cutting tools were used to sever plant stems near ground level so the seed-bearing portions could be collected. The cut plants were gathered into bundles and transported from fields to areas where processing would occur. This work occupied many days and involved all household members capable of contributing physical labor to the task. Threshing separated seeds from the rest of the plant material after harvesting was completed for the season. The bundled plants were beaten with tools or trampled to break seeds free from their attachments to stems. The resulting mixture of seeds and plant debris was collected together for further processing in subsequent steps. Threshing required repeated striking or trampling of the same plant material to ensure complete seed separation occurred. Winnowing removed lighter plant debris from heavier seeds by tossing the mixture into moving air repeatedly. The wind carried away the lighter chaff while the seeds fell back down to collecting surfaces below. This process was repeated many times until the seed was sufficiently clean for storage without excessive debris mixed in. Winnowing happened outdoors during times when steady breezes provided the air movement needed for effective separation. Cleaned seeds were placed in large storage containers where they would remain until needed for planting or food. These containers were sealed to prevent moisture entry and to exclude insects and rodents from accessing contents. The filled containers were moved to storage areas within dwellings or in separate structures built for this purpose. Regular checking ensured stored seed remained dry and free from infestation throughout the storage period until use. Straw and other plant material left after threshing and winnowing served various purposes around the dwelling and fields. Some was used as bedding for animals kept in enclosures near the living areas of people. Other portions were mixed into soil to improve its structure and fertility for future growing seasons ahead. Excess material was burned or left to decompose slowly in piles located away from immediate dwelling areas. Animals kept near dwellings required daily feeding with grain or plant materials reserved for this purpose from stores. The amount given to each animal was based on its size and on experience with feeding over time. Water was provided in containers that were refilled as animals drank throughout each day and night period. The feeding routine happened at similar times each day following patterns established through long repetition without variation. Enclosures for animals were cleaned periodically to remove accumulated waste that built up on floors and ground surfaces. This material was carried away and placed in designated areas where it aged before being spread on fields. Fresh bedding material was added after cleaning to provide animals with clean, dry surfaces for resting between activity. The frequency of cleaning depended on the number of animals and the size of the enclosure space available. Animal health was monitored through observation of behavior and appearance during daily feeding and watering activities performed regularly. Signs of illness or injury were noted and simple treatments were applied based on knowledge passed down over time. Serious problems sometimes resulted in animal death despite efforts to provide care and support for recovery. Dead animals were removed from enclosures and disposed of in locations away from water sources and dwellings. Breeding of animals happened according to natural patterns with minimal intervention beyond keeping males and females in proximity. Young animals were born during certain seasons and required extra attention from people to ensure their survival. Newborns needed protection from weather and predators during their first days and weeks of life outside mothers. The number of animals increased or decreased over time based on births and deaths occurring each year. Milk from certain animals was collected daily for consumption or for processing into other food products used regularly. The collection happened at consistent times each day to maintain milk production at steady levels over long periods. Fresh milk was consumed soon after collection or was processed immediately to prevent spoilage in warm conditions. Processing included heating or fermenting or separating components of milk into different products with varying storage properties. Butter was made by agitating milk or cream until fat particles combined into solid masses separated from liquid. This agitation was accomplished by shaking containers or by using tools that stirred contents continuously until separation occurred. The resulting butter was collected and shaped into portions suitable for storage or immediate use in cooking. The remaining liquid was consumed as a beverage or was fed to animals as supplementary nutrition source. Cheese production involved adding certain substances to milk that caused it to separate into solid and liquid portions. The solids were collected and pressed to remove excess liquid and to form dense masses that kept longer. These masses were stored in cool areas where they aged and developed flavors over periods of weeks or months. Different methods and materials produced cheeses with varying characteristics that were recognized and preferred for specific uses. Eggs from birds were collected daily from nesting areas where the birds returned regularly to lay them. The eggs were gathered carefully to prevent breakage and were stored in cool locations until needed for meals. Fresh eggs were consumed within days of collection while older eggs were used in cooking where their age mattered less. Broken eggs were fed to animals or used immediately to prevent waste of the food material they contained. Feathers from birds were collected and saved for use in making bedding or in other applications where softness mattered. These materials were cleaned and dried before being stuffed into fabric casings to create pillows or mattresses for sleeping. The same feather-filled items were used for extended periods until they became compressed or damaged from repeated use. New feathers were added periodically to restore adequate softness and volume for continued comfort during sleep periods each night. Gardens located near dwellings provided vegetables and herbs used in daily meal preparation throughout growing seasons each year. The soil in these areas received regular attention to maintain fertility and structure suitable for plant growth. Composted plant material and animal waste were mixed into garden soil before planting to provide nutrients plants absorbed. This mixing happened at the beginning of each growing season using tools that turned and combined materials together. Seeds for garden plants were saved from previous years or were obtained from neighboring households through sharing arrangements. These seeds were kept separate by plant type to prevent confusion during planting and to maintain desired varieties. Small plots within gardens were designated for specific plants based on their requirements for sun and water and space. The same arrangements were used year after year with minor adjustments based on observations from previous growing experiences. Planting in gardens happened earlier than in fields because smaller areas were easier to protect from cold weather. Seeds were placed in shallow depressions made in soil and covered lightly to protect them during germination period. Spacing between seeds followed patterns learned through experience to allow adequate room for mature plant size later. Multiple seeds were often planted in each location to ensure at least one would successfully germinate and grow. Young plants emerging from soil required protection from insects and from animals that found tender shoots appealing to eat. Simple barriers made from sticks or woven materials were placed around vulnerable plants until they grew larger and sturdier. These protective measures were adjusted or removed as plants developed and became less susceptible to damage from these sources. The barriers were stored after use and were placed again around new plantings in subsequent seasons without modification. Watering of garden plants happened more frequently than watering of field crops due to smaller root systems in vegetables. Water was carried from storage vessels or from nearby sources and poured directly onto soil around plant bases. The frequency of watering depended on rainfall and on temperatures that increased evaporation rates during hotter parts of year. Dry soil was moistened until water penetrated to depths where roots could access it for plant use regularly. Vegetables reached harvest readiness at different times depending on plant type and on growing conditions during that season. Plants were checked regularly to identify which ones had produced vegetables of appropriate size for picking and consumption. Harvesting happened continuously throughout the growing season as different plants matured rather than all at once like grain. Picked vegetables were brought directly to dwelling areas for cleaning and preparation for meals that same day typically. Some vegetables were preserved for use during seasons when gardens produced nothing due to cold or dry conditions. These preservation methods included drying in sun or storing in cool dark locations where decay happened more slowly. Vegetables that stored well were kept whole while others were cut or processed before storage to extend usability. The success of preservation efforts varied and some stored food spoiled despite precautions taken during preparation and storage. Dried vegetables were stored in containers or hung in bundles from ceiling supports where air circulation prevented mold growth. Rehydrating these vegetables before cooking involved soaking them in water for periods sufficient to restore softer texture similar to fresh. The flavor and texture of dried vegetables differed from fresh but provided necessary nutrition during times when gardens lay dormant. The same preservation techniques were used generation after generation with consistent results in most years under normal conditions. Root vegetables could remain in ground through cold seasons if soil did not freeze deeply enough to damage them. These plants were harvested as needed throughout winter months by digging them from earth when required for meals. Leaving them in ground eliminated need for separate storage space and kept them fresh until actual use time. Remaining roots were harvested before spring planting began to clear space for new season crops in same locations. Plants that produced seeds used in cooking were allowed to fully mature and dry before harvesting for storage. These seed heads were cut from plants and hung in dry locations where remaining moisture evaporated over days. Once completely dry, the seeds were separated from surrounding plant material and stored in sealed containers until needed. Seeds for both planting and eating were sometimes taken from same plants when sufficient quantity existed for both purposes. Garden maintenance required regular removal of dead plant material and spent plants after harvest periods ended for each type. This clearing prevented disease and pests from establishing themselves in decaying organic matter left on soil surface. The removed material was added to compost areas or fed to animals depending on its condition and suitability. Cleared garden areas were left bare or were planted with different crops that grew during cooler seasons in some regions. Fruit trees or bushes near dwellings produced food during specific seasons when conditions allowed flower development and fruit maturation. These plants required less daily attention than annual garden plants but needed occasional pruning and care to maintain production. Dead or damaged branches were removed to improve air circulation and to direct growth energy into remaining healthy wood. This pruning happened during dormant seasons when plants were not actively growing or producing flowers or fruit at time. Ripe fruit was picked from trees or bushes when color and firmness indicated readiness for consumption or processing soon. Fruit left too long on plants often fell to ground where it attracted insects and began to decay rapidly. Picked fruit was sorted based on ripeness, with firmest pieces stored for later use and softest consumed immediately that day. The quantity of fruit produced varied significantly from year to year based on weather during flowering and growing periods. Preservation of fruit included drying in sun or cooking with sweeteners to create preparations that resisted spoilage for extended periods. Dried fruit required several days of sun exposure with periodic turning to ensure even moisture removal from all surfaces. The dried pieces became firm and dark and were stored in containers where they remained edible for many months. Prepared fruit mixtures were stored in sealed vessels and consumed gradually throughout seasons when fresh fruit was unavailable from trees. Fruit that had begun to ferment was sometimes intentionally allowed to continue this process to create beverages consumed by adults. The fermentation happened in sealed containers over periods of days or weeks depending on temperatures and desired final characteristics. These beverages were stored in cool locations to slow further fermentation and to maintain consistent taste over time. The same methods were used for different types of fruit with variations in specific steps based on characteristics of each. Nut trees produced food that required collection from ground after nuts fell naturally from branches when fully mature. The timing of nut fall varied by tree type but generally happened during certain seasons each year predictably. Fallen nuts were gathered regularly to prevent animals from consuming them or to collect them before weather-damaged shells. The gathered nuts were dried further if needed and stored in locations that prevented moisture exposure and insect infestation problems. Shells protecting nut meat inside required cracking using stones or other hard implements to access edible portions within each. This cracking was done as nuts were needed for meals rather than processing entire stored quantities at once. Cracked nuts exposed to air began to develop unpleasant flavors over time, so only immediate needs were prepared usually. Shells and other waste from nut processing were discarded in usual waste areas or were burned in fires as fuel. Nut oils were extracted by crushing nut meat and heating it or pressing it to separate liquid fat from solid material. These oils were used in cooking or for treating wood and leather items that benefited from oil application regularly. The extraction process was time-consuming and resulted in relatively small quantities of oil from large amounts of nuts. This made nut oil valuable, and its use was reserved for purposes where other oils could not serve adequately. Wild plants growing in areas beyond cultivated gardens and fields provided additional food sources gathered during appropriate seasons annually. Knowledge of which plants were edible and when they were ready for collection had been passed down over time. The same gathering locations were visited year after year when plants reached suitable stages for harvesting and consumption safely. Some wild foods supplemented cultivated crops while others were only consumed when stored foods ran low between harvests regularly. Gathering of wild plants required walking to areas where they grew naturally without any cultivation or maintenance by people. The distance to these areas varied depending on local availability and on how much had been gathered in recent seasons. Plant parts collected included leaves and roots and seeds and flowers depending on the species and time of year. Gathered materials were carried back in baskets or bundles and were processed similarly to cultivated plants from garden areas. Water sources near dwellings required regular maintenance to ensure continued access to clean water for all household needs throughout year. Wells were checked periodically for debris that had fallen into the water or for soil that had eroded from walls. Removing accumulated material from well bottoms involved lowering containers on ropes to scoop out unwanted substances blocking flow. The same maintenance tasks were performed at intervals determined by the rate at which material accumulated in each location. Pathways to water sources became muddy during wet seasons and required placement of stones or wood to provide solid surfaces. These improvements were made gradually as materials became available and as problem areas developed along frequently traveled routes. The same pathway sections needed repeated attention as added materials shifted or sank into soft ground beneath them. Maintenance of pathways was ongoing work that never reached a final completed state but continued indefinitely over time. Containers used for water transport developed cracks or leaks that required repair to maintain their usefulness for daily tasks. Small cracks were sealed with materials that dried to form waterproof barriers over damaged areas of vessels. Larger damage sometimes made repair impossible, and the container was replaced with a new one made using familiar methods. The replaced containers were broken down and the materials were reused for other purposes when possible or discarded otherwise. Rope used to lower containers into wells wore thin from friction against well edges during repeated raising and lowering. These worn sections were identified during routine inspections and were replaced before complete failure caused loss of containers. New rope sections were attached using knots that had been learned and practiced until they could be tied reliably. The replaced rope pieces were kept for other uses where their reduced strength was still adequate for lighter tasks. Drinking water was sometimes treated by allowing it to sit in vessels where particles settled to bottom over time. The clearer water near the top was used first while sediment remained undisturbed at the bottom of containers. This settling happened naturally without intervention and improved the clarity of water used for drinking and cooking purposes. The settled material was eventually discarded and the container was cleaned before being filled again from the source. Storage of water in large vessels inside dwellings ensured supply was available during times when trips to sources were inconvenient. These vessels were positioned near areas where water was used most frequently to minimize carrying distances within structures. The vessels were refilled before they emptied completely to ensure water remained available at all times for household needs. Cleaning of storage vessels happened periodically to remove accumulation that developed on interior surfaces from minerals in water. Seasonal changes affected water availability from rivers and streams that decreased in volume during dry parts of year. Lower water levels meant longer distances to reach water or deeper digging required to access water in well bottoms. These seasonal patterns were familiar and expected, and preparations were made before dry periods arrived each year predictably. Additional storage capacity was sometimes added to hold larger reserves when water collection became more difficult or time-consuming. Rainwater was collected from roof surfaces during wet seasons and directed into storage vessels through simple channel systems made of wood or clay. The first water from each rain event was often discarded because it contained dust and debris from roof surfaces. Subsequent water was cleaner and was collected for use in the same ways as water from other sources. Rain collection reduced the frequency of trips to wells or rivers during seasons when rainfall was regular and abundant. Ice formed on water surfaces during coldest parts of year in some regions and required breaking before water could be accessed. Simple tools were used to create openings in ice layers thick enough to support weight of a person standing on surface. The effort required to maintain access to water increased during frozen periods, but the same tasks were performed regardless of conditions. Melting snow provided an alternative water source when available and when collection methods were practical to use in conditions. Snow was gathered in containers and brought inside where warmth from fires caused it to melt into liquid water. The amount of snow needed to produce useful quantities of water was larger than expected because snow contained much air. Melted snow water was used in the same ways as water from other sources after any debris was removed. This collection method was only used when other water sources were inaccessible or when snow was abundant near dwellings. River water was taken from locations upstream from areas where animals gathered or where waste was deposited into flowing water. The same collection spots were used repeatedly because they were known to provide water of acceptable quality for household use. Changes in river flow sometimes made usual collection points unusable, and alternative locations were selected nearby temporarily until conditions changed. Knowledge of suitable water sources was passed to younger people through direct instruction and observation over years of living together. Streams that flowed only during certain seasons provided water when present but dried completely during other parts of year. These seasonal water sources were used when available, but households relied on year-round sources for basic needs throughout all seasons. The appearance of water in seasonal streams indicated changes in weather patterns and marked transitions between different parts of year. The same streams filled and emptied according to patterns that remained consistent across many years of observation by inhabitants. Wells that served multiple households required coordination among users to ensure fair access and to maintain structures benefiting everyone using them. This coordination happened through informal discussions rather than through formal rules written down or enforced by specific people assigned roles. The maintenance work was divided among users in ways that balanced contributions roughly equally over longer time periods. Conflicts over access or maintenance responsibility were unusual and were resolved through conversation when they occurred at all. Shallow wells sometimes produced water with unpleasant taste or with visible particles that made it less desirable for drinking purposes. This water was still used for washing and for animals, but cleaner sources were preferred for drinking and cooking. The quality differences between sources were known through experience, and appropriate uses were selected for each source based on characteristics. Digging deeper sometimes improved water quality by reaching layers where filtration through soil had removed more impurities naturally. New wells were dug when existing sources became inadequate for growing household needs or when water quality declined over time. The location for new wells was selected based on observations of where water appeared naturally or where digging seemed likely to reach water. Digging proceeded downward through soil and rock until water began to seep into the bottom of the excavation. The walls of new wells were lined with stones or wood to prevent collapse and to keep soil from falling in. Well digging required extended effort over many days or weeks depending on depth needed to reach water-bearing layers. Multiple people took turns digging and removing soil from the deepening hole being created in ground below. The removed soil was piled nearby and was later used to build up areas around the dwelling or to fill low spots. Completed wells were covered when not in use to prevent accidents and to keep debris and animals out of water. Covering materials for wells included wooden lids or woven mats that could be moved aside when access was needed for drawing water. These coverings required replacement periodically as they deteriorated from exposure to weather and from handling during daily use cycles. The same design was used for replacement covers without modification because the design had proven functional over extended time. Materials for covers were kept available so replacements could be made quickly when existing covers failed or wore out. Drawing water from wells involved lowering containers attached to ropes until they submerged and filled with water from below. The filled containers were then raised by pulling the rope hand over hand until they reached ground level. This lifting required steady effort, especially when containers were large or when wells were deep and rope was heavy. The same motion was repeated multiple times during each water collection trip to fill all containers being transported back. Spilled water around well openings made the ground slippery and required careful foot placement to prevent falls during water collection. The wet areas dried between collection times but became wet again with each subsequent use of the well opening. Stones or wooden planks were sometimes placed around wells to provide better footing on surfaces that remained dry longer. These improvements reduced the risk of accidents during routine water collection activities performed by all household members regularly. Grain storage areas required regular inspection to identify signs of moisture or pests that could damage stored food supplies. The containers holding grain were opened and the contents were examined by looking at surface layers and by feeling texture. Any unusual odors were noted as indicators of potential spoilage developing within the stored grain below visible surfaces. The same inspections were performed at regular intervals throughout the year without regard to whether problems had been found previously. Rodents sometimes gained entry to storage areas through small openings in walls or through gaps around doorways and openings. These animals consumed grain and contaminated larger quantities with their waste during nighttime visits to storage locations. Efforts to exclude rodents included blocking discovered entry points with stones or packed mud that hardened when dry. Cats were sometimes kept near storage areas to reduce rodent populations through their natural hunting behaviors and presence alone. Insects that infested stored grain reproduced within the containers and increased in number if conditions remained favorable for them. These insects were removed when containers were emptied by sifting grain through woven screens with openings too small for passage. The removed insects were discarded or fed to chickens that consumed them readily as supplementary food source available regularly. Cleaned grain was returned to storage in containers that had been emptied and cleaned of all remaining material first. Temperature in storage areas affected how well grain kept over the months between harvest and eventual use for meals. Cooler locations slowed the development of insects and mold that thrived in warmer conditions throughout the year generally. Storage structures were positioned in shaded areas or were built partially underground where temperatures remained more stable and moderate. The same storage methods were used by previous generations and were continued without significant changes to established practices. Moisture in storage areas was controlled by ensuring roofs remained intact and by maintaining walls that prevented rain penetration inward. Air circulation through small openings helped reduce humidity that accumulated from temperature changes between day and night periods. Grain stored in damp conditions developed mold growth that made it unsuitable for consumption and required disposal of affected portions. Preventing moisture problems was easier than addressing them after they developed in stored grain supplies meant for later use. Containers for grain storage were made from materials that resisted moisture and that excluded insects from accessing contents inside them. Clay vessels with tight-fitting lids provided effective protection when properly sealed after filling with dried grain from harvests. Woven baskets lined with clay or with other impermeable materials also served as storage containers in some households. The choice of container type depended on available materials and on traditional practices passed down through generations of users. Sealing of storage containers involved using clay or wax or other materials to fill gaps between lids and container openings completely. These seals were inspected periodically and were repaired or replaced when cracks or gaps appeared from handling or aging. Properly sealed containers kept insects out and prevented moisture from entering during humid weather or rainy seasons each year. Breaking seals to access stored grain happened only when the grain was needed for immediate use in meal preparation. Moving grain from large storage containers to smaller daily use containers happened at intervals determined by household consumption rates observed. The transfer process provided opportunity to inspect grain quality and to identify any problems developing in storage before they affected. Smaller containers near cooking areas were refilled as they emptied through daily use without requiring access to main storage. This system reduced the frequency with which main storage containers needed to be opened and resealed during normal use. Dust and chaff mixed with stored grain settled to bottom of containers over time as grain was removed from top. This accumulated material was eventually removed when containers were emptied and cleaned before refilling after new harvest season arrived. The removed dust and chaff were fed to animals or were added to compost areas where they decomposed slowly. Empty containers were inspected for damage and were repaired if needed before being returned to service for another storage cycle. Grain that remained from previous harvests when new harvest arrived was used first before newer grain was accessed for consumption. This rotation ensured older grain was consumed while still suitable for eating rather than being stored until quality declined further. Mixing old and new grain together made tracking storage time more difficult, so the supplies were kept separate when possible. Households attempted to estimate harvest quantities needed to last until next harvest, with minimal excess remaining after new supplies arrived. Years when harvests were smaller than usual required careful management of grain supplies to ensure they lasted until next harvest season. Consumption rates were reduced through smaller meal portions or by using more vegetables and other foods to supplement grain. These adjustments were made gradually as stored quantities decreased and concerns about adequacy increased over time, passing slowly. Neighboring households sometimes shared grain supplies when some had surplus while others faced shortages from poor harvest results that year. Spoiled grain that could not be consumed safely was removed from storage and was disposed of away from dwellings immediately. This grain was not fed to animals because it could cause illness in them as well as in people. The quantity of spoilage was minimized through proper storage practices, but some loss was expected as normal part of storing food. Reduced storage losses from one year to next were considered improvements resulting from better practices or from more favorable conditions. Testing grain quality involved cooking small amounts and evaluating taste and texture before using larger quantities for regular meals for household. Grain that had developed unpleasant flavors from storage was still used if no alternatives existed for feeding people adequately. The threshold for what was considered acceptable quality varied depending on availability of other food sources at given time. Standards were lower when food was scarce and higher when alternatives were readily available from recent harvests or gathering. Ventilation of storage areas happened by opening doorways or other closable openings during dry weather to allow air movement through. This air exchange helped reduce moisture accumulation and discouraged insect activity through disruption of stable environmental conditions they preferred naturally. The openings were closed again during rain or during times when insects were particularly active to prevent entry into storage. Balancing ventilation needs against security from pests and weather required attention and judgment based on current conditions outside. Storage structures separate from main dwellings were used in some locations to keep grain supplies away from living areas. These structures were built using similar methods as dwellings but were designed specifically for storage rather than for habitation by people. Separate storage reduced risk that fire or other damage to dwelling would destroy food supplies needed for survival until next harvest. The distance between storage and dwelling was kept short enough for convenient access but far enough to provide some protection. Floors of storage structures were raised above ground level to reduce moisture penetration from below and to discourage rodents from entry. Posts or stones supported floors made of wood or packed materials that created barrier between stored grain and damp earth. The space beneath raised floors remained empty and was occasionally checked for animal nests or other problems developing under storage areas. Repairs to floor supports happened when posts rotted or when stones shifted from their positions over time and settling. Walls of storage structures had fewer openings than dwelling walls to reduce entry points for pests and weather into interior space. Small gaps were left near the roof line to allow air circulation while keeping openings too small for birds or larger animals. These ventilation gaps were sometimes covered with woven materials that allowed air movement but blocked insect entry during seasons when the covering materials required replacement periodically as they degraded from sun exposure and from moisture in air passing through them. Roofs of storage structures were maintained with same attention as dwelling roofs to ensure stored grain remained dry during all weather. Leaks in storage structure roofs were addressed immediately upon discovery because moisture damage to stored grain happened quickly once water entered. The consequences of roof failure in storage areas were more severe than in dwelling areas where damage was limited. This made storage structure maintenance a priority activity that received attention before problems developed when possible through regular inspection. Light inside dwellings came from openings in walls and from fires burning in designated areas during all hours of use. The amount of natural light varied with time of day and with weather conditions that affected brightness outside structures. Additional light was needed during evening hours and was provided by burning materials that produced flame without excessive smoke indoors. These light sources were prepared and maintained as part of daily routines performed by household members taking turns at tasks. Oil lamps made from clay or stone held liquid fuel that burned through wicks made of twisted plant fibers or cloth. The wicks drew oil upward where it burned at the exposed tip, producing small steady flame for illumination purposes. These lamps required refilling when oil levels dropped below the point where wicks could reach remaining fuel in containers. Wicks needed trimming periodically to remove charred portions that caused smoking or reduced flame brightness during burning hours each evening. Oil for lamps came from plants or animals and was stored in sealed containers until needed for filling lamps. The same oils used in cooking were sometimes used in lamps, though some oils burned cleaner than others did. Lamp oil was considered valuable because producing it required effort and because consumption was steady throughout darker months each year. Households attempted to produce or obtain sufficient oil to meet lighting needs without excessive surplus that would require long-term storage. Candles made from animal fat or from plant waxes provided alternative lighting that required no container for fuel holding during use. These were formed by repeatedly dipping wicks into melted fat or wax until sufficient material built up around the wick. The cooled candles were stored until needed and were burned by lighting the exposed wick at one end of formed shape. Burning consumed the candle gradually from top downward until all fuel material had melted and burned away completely over hours. Smoke from indoor fires and from lighting reduced air quality inside dwellings and created dark deposits on walls and ceilings over time. These deposits built up gradually and were generally not removed unless they became thick enough to affect structural materials beneath them. The same darkening happened in all dwellings where fires burned regularly and was considered normal rather than problematic in most cases. Adequate ventilation reduced smoke accumulation but never eliminated it entirely from interior spaces where combustion occurred for heating and cooking. Soot from smoke was sometimes collected from surfaces and was mixed with other materials to create black coloring used for various purposes. This collection happened during cleaning of fire areas or when soot accumulation became thick enough to warrant removal from nearby surfaces. The collected material was stored in small containers and was used sparingly because gathering it required scraping from multiple locations. Most soot remained on surfaces where it had been deposited and was simply allowed to accumulate over months and years. Windows in dwellings were openings that could be covered or left open depending on weather and on need for light inside. Coverings included wooden shutters or fabric or animal skin stretched across openings to block wind and rain from entering spaces. These coverings reduced light entering the dwelling, so their use involved balancing protection from weather against need for interior illumination. During mild weather, openings remained uncovered throughout day to maximize natural light available for activities performed inside dwelling spaces regularly. Doorways served as primary openings for entry and exit and also provided significant light to interior spaces when left open fully. Doors made from wood or woven materials could be closed to provide privacy and to reduce heat loss during cold weather. The decision to keep doors open or closed depended on current conditions and on activities being performed inside at given time. Heavy doors required effort to move and were opened and closed less frequently than lighter coverings that could be adjusted easily. Sleep happened during dark hours when light levels made other activities difficult to perform safely or effectively inside or outside dwellings. People prepared sleeping areas as daylight decreased and fires were allowed to burn lower after evening meals had been completed. The transition to sleep happened gradually as activity levels decreased and household members moved to their designated sleeping locations within structure. Some fire was usually maintained overnight to provide warmth and to serve as source for relighting larger fires in morning hours. Waking happened when light entering through openings increased enough to penetrate through closed eyelids of sleeping people naturally without intervention. The exact time of waking varied with seasons as daylight hours changed throughout the year in regular cycles. First person awake often rekindled fire from remaining coals so warmth and light were available when others woke shortly after. The household gradually became active as individuals woke and began moving about to start daily tasks that followed familiar sequences. Morning activities began with fire tending and with water collection and with other routine tasks that prepared household for day ahead. These activities followed similar patterns each day with minor variations based on specific needs or conditions requiring attention at time. The predictability of morning routines meant little conscious planning was needed to accomplish necessary preparations for daily activities outside and inside dwelling. Each person knew their usual responsibilities and performed them without detailed instruction or coordination with others in most cases. Nighttime hours were generally quiet periods when activity was minimal except for attending to fires or to animals requiring care. People remained in or very near dwellings during darkness because limited visibility made movement difficult and potentially dangerous in unfamiliar areas. Conversation sometimes continued after dark but gradually diminished as individuals became tired and withdrew to sleeping areas for rest. The sounds of nighttime included fire crackling and animal noises and occasional human movements as people adjusted sleeping positions or attended. Seasonal variations in daylight duration affected how much time was available for outdoor work and how much time was spent inside. Longer days during warm seasons allowed extended periods of field work and outdoor activity before darkness arrived each evening. Shorter days during cold seasons meant more time spent inside dwellings where artificial light extended usable hours somewhat beyond natural daylight. The rhythm of activity adjusted naturally to these seasonal changes without requiring conscious modification of established patterns and household routines. Dreams during sleep were sometimes remembered upon waking and were occasionally discussed among household members during morning activities or meals. These dreams were not considered particularly significant in most cases and were simply part of sleep experience that everyone had. Some dreams were more vivid or unusual and received more attention in conversations, but this attention faded as daily activities progressed. Most dreams were forgotten quickly after waking and were not recalled later in the day or in subsequent days at all. Fatigue accumulated during days of physical work and was relieved through sleep each night in recurring cycles throughout all seasons. The amount of sleep needed varied somewhat among individuals but generally followed similar patterns across all household members over time. Insufficient sleep resulted in reduced capacity for work and an increased tendency toward errors or accidents during task performance the following day. Adequate sleep was maintained through retiring to sleeping areas when tiredness became apparent rather than continuing activities into late hours. Illness sometimes disrupted normal sleep patterns and required affected individuals to rest during daylight hours as well as at night. These periods of extended rest allowed the body to direct energy toward recovery rather than toward normal work activities performed daily. Other household members adjusted their activities to accommodate reduced participation from ill individuals until recovery allowed return to usual routines. The duration of illness-related rest varied depending on severity and on the nature of the condition affecting the individual at time. Injuries from accidents or from animal interactions also necessitated periods of reduced activity while healing occurred over days or weeks depending. Serious injuries limited mobility and required the injured person to remain in or near the dwelling until healing progressed sufficiently. Other household members performed the tasks usually done by injured individual during recovery period to maintain household functioning adequately. Some injuries healed completely while others resulted in permanent limitations that required adjustments to how tasks were divided among members. Aging gradually reduced physical capacity for demanding work and led to shifts in which tasks individuals performed within household over years. Older people took on less physically demanding responsibilities while younger adults handled heavier labor in fields and in construction activities. This transition happened gradually rather than suddenly and involved ongoing adjustments as capabilities changed with advancing age over long time periods. Knowledge held by older individuals was shared with younger ones through verbal instruction and through demonstration during joint performance of tasks. Grain processing required equipment that was maintained through regular cleaning and through replacement of worn parts when necessary for continued function. Grinding stones accumulated residue that needed removal to prevent contamination of newly ground flour with old material that had hardened. Cleaning involved scraping surfaces with tools and then rinsing with water if the stone type allowed such treatment without damage. The same cleaning process was performed after each use or after multiple uses depending on household practices established over time. Grindstone surfaces that became too smooth from extended use no longer gripped grain effectively during grinding process and required roughening or replacement. Roughening was accomplished by pecking the surface with harder stones to create new texture that improved grinding effectiveness temporarily. This maintenance extended the usable life of grinding stones, but eventually replacement became necessary when roughening no longer restored adequate function. New grinding stones were selected from available sources and were shaped if needed to fit into existing grinding equipment setups. Wooden mortars used for pounding grain or other foods developed cracks or wore thin from repeated impacts of pestles during use. These cracks sometimes could be bound with cordage or with metal bands if available to prevent further splitting of wood. Mortars that split completely were replaced with new ones carved from suitable wood pieces found or obtained for this purpose specifically. The carving process required time and effort but produced equipment that served for extended periods before replacement became necessary again. Pestles used for pounding wore down gradually at the striking end from impacts against mortar bottoms during food processing activities. The shortened pestles remained usable until they became too short for comfortable grip or effective striking motion during pounding tasks. Worn pestles were sometimes repurposed as handles for other tools or were used as fuel for fires when no other use remained. New pestles were shaped from straight branches or from split wood pieces that provided appropriate size and weight for pounding work. Sieves made from woven materials or from perforated leather separated fine flour from coarser particles after grinding was completed each time. These sieves wore out from abrasion and from handling and required periodic replacement to maintain effectiveness in separating particles properly. The holes in sieves gradually enlarged from use until particles that should be retained passed through along with desired fine flour. New sieves were made using the same materials and techniques as previous ones without notable changes to construction methods employed. Baskets used for carrying grain and flour developed worn spots where hands gripped them repeatedly during transport between work locations. These worn areas weakened the basket structure and sometimes led to failure where bottoms separated from sides during carrying of loads. Repairs involved adding reinforcing materials to damaged areas or replacing entire sections of basket construction as needed for continued use. Baskets beyond repair were dismantled and materials were saved for use in making new baskets or for other purposes. Storage of processing equipment when not in active use protected it from weather and from damage by animals or children. Designated locations for each piece of equipment ensured items could be found easily when needed again for next use. The same storage locations were used consistently, so the act of retrieving equipment required no thought or searching through dwelling spaces. This organization developed naturally over time as people established routines for tool storage and retrieval during daily activities performed repeatedly. Flour containers near cooking areas collected dust and debris from the air and required emptying and cleaning at regular intervals throughout year. The cleaning process involved dumping remaining flour and washing container interiors to remove accumulated material stuck to surfaces inside thoroughly. Dried containers were refilled from main flour storage after cleaning was completed and they had dried completely from washing. The frequency of cleaning depended on how quickly containers became noticeably dirty during normal use in cooking area environments. Meal planning happened informally based on available ingredients and on time available for food preparation during particular day or part of day. The same types of meals were prepared repeatedly with minor variations based on what ingredients were most readily available at given time. Little advance planning was needed because preparation methods were familiar and because ingredient storage locations were known to all who participated. Meals emerged from this system without requiring extensive discussion or coordination among people who would prepare and consume the food. Leftover food from meals was consumed at next meal or was given to animals if it had begun to spoil from sitting. The amount of leftover food was generally small because portions were based on experience with household consumption patterns over time. Food that remained edible was covered and protected from insects until it could be consumed by people later same day. Spoiled food was discarded in usual disposal areas rather than being fed to animals that might be harmed by consuming it. Serving of food at meals involved placing prepared items in central locations where people could take portions for themselves individually. Larger pieces were broken or cut into smaller portions that could be handled easily during eating without need for additional tools. Shared serving vessels were used until food was depleted and then vessels were set aside for cleaning after meal was completed. The same vessels appeared at meals repeatedly until they broke or until they were replaced for reasons of damage or wear. Eating positions during meals were not formally assigned, but people generally occupied the same locations relative to others during most meals. This consistency developed through habit rather than through explicit rules about where each person should sit or stand during eating. Children sat near adults who monitored their eating and provided assistance when needed with difficult food items or portions that needed cutting. The informal organization worked adequately without requiring enforcement or discussion under normal circumstances that prevailed during most meals shared together. Conversation during meals was quiet and focused on practical matters related to current activities or to plans for immediate future tasks. Extended discussions of other topics happened at other times rather than during meals when attention was directed toward eating the food. The amount of conversation varied with household composition and with individual preferences for talking during meals versus eating in relative quiet. No particular pattern was considered more correct than others, so variation among households was accepted as normal difference without judgment attached. Cleanup after meals began while some people were still finishing their food portions and continued until all items had been washed. Water for washing was heated during meal preparation so it was ready when needed for cleanup activities afterward without delay. Washing involved scrubbing items with hands or with rough materials to remove stuck food particles from surfaces of vessels and utensils. Rinsed items were placed in locations where they could dry before being returned to storage areas for use at next meal. Disposal of wash water happened outside dwelling in locations designated for liquid waste from cooking and cleaning activities performed daily. These disposal areas absorbed the water gradually and the location was moved when standing water indicated absorption capacity had been exceeded. Grease and food particles in wash water attracted insects and animals, so disposal areas were positioned away from immediate dwelling surroundings. The same considerations applied to disposal of wash water as applied to disposal of solid wastes from household activities generally. Drying of washed items sometimes happened in sun if weather permitted or near fire if items needed to be dried quickly. The drying time varied with material and with environmental conditions present at time of washing and placement for drying afterward. Items that remained damp were more likely to develop mold or unpleasant odors, so adequate drying was important for maintaining quality. Incompletely dried items were sometimes used again before fully dry if they were needed for next meal preparation before drying finished. Stacking of dried vessels and utensils in storage locations happened in ways that kept similar items together for easier retrieval when needed. Heavy items were placed on lower levels and lighter items were stacked above to prevent crushing or breakage from weight. The stacking arrangements were similar each time items were put away, so retrieving specific pieces required minimal searching or moving. This consistency developed through repeated practice and through corrections when items were not found where expected during retrieval attempts. Reorganization of storage areas happened occasionally when accumulated items made retrieval difficult or when new items needed space in existing locations. The reorganization involved removing all items and cleaning the storage area before returning items in new arrangements that worked better. These reorganizations were infrequent because they required significant time and because existing arrangements generally functioned adequately for daily needs without change. Small adjustments happened more often than complete reorganizations as people shifted items slightly to accommodate changing household needs over shorter time periods. Broken items discovered during storage or retrieval were removed. Immediately to prevent injury from sharp edges or from fragments that separated from main pieces. The broken pieces were taken to disposal areas or were set aside for repair attempts if damage seemed fixable with available methods. Items that could not be repaired were broken down further if useful materials could be recovered for other purposes before final disposal. The loss of functional items meant replacements needed to be made or obtained to maintain adequate supplies for household use. Fields required ongoing attention to maintain productivity across multiple growing seasons without significant decline in yields from soil exhaustion over time. The same fields were planted year after year with occasional periods of rest when no crops were grown in particular sections. Resting fields allowed soil to recover nutrients depleted by previous crops through natural processes occurring without human intervention over months. The decision to rest particular fields was based on observed decreases in plant growth or yields during previous seasons. Soil in fields that had been cultivated for extended periods sometimes became harder and less able to absorb water properly. Breaking up this compacted soil required more effort than initial preparation had required in earlier years of field use. Tools penetrated less deeply into hardened soil and progress was slower when turning earth before planting new crops each season. Multiple passes over the same ground were needed to achieve adequate soil preparation for seed planting in fields used continuously. Erosion from rainfall carried soil away from fields gradually over years, especially in areas with slopes or poor plant cover. Accumulation of eroded soil in low areas created uneven field surfaces that affected water distribution and plant growth patterns across affected. Efforts to reduce erosion included maintaining plant cover on field margins and directing water flow away from vulnerable areas when possible. Despite these efforts, some soil loss continued each year as natural result of rainfall patterns occurring in the region. Stones appeared on field surfaces each year after soil had been turned and had been worked in preparation for planting. These stones were removed by hand and were carried to field edges where they were piled or used in construction. The same fields required stone removal year after year as freezing and thawing cycles pushed buried stones upward to surface levels. This stone removal was considered normal part of field preparation and was performed without particular notice or comment by workers. Boundaries between fields and other land uses were marked using stones or by planting rows of plants or by other visible means. These markers required maintenance to remain clear as vegetation grew or as markers were displaced by weather or by animals passing. Disputes about exact boundary locations were rare because markers had been established long before and were known to all who used nearby. The same boundary positions were maintained across generations unless all parties agreed to changes for specific shared reasons over time. Pathways through and between fields developed through repeated foot traffic and were maintained by clearing plant growth that encroached from sides regularly. These pathways provided access for people moving between dwelling areas and work locations in fields throughout each day of growing season. The width of pathways was determined by frequency of use and by whether loads were carried requiring extra space for passage. Heavily used pathways became worn below surrounding field surface levels from continuous traffic compacting and removing soil over many seasons of use. Tools carried to fields needed to be transported at start of each work period and returned at end of day or work session. Carrying tools repeatedly over same pathways required physical effort that was simply part of work routine accepted without consideration of alternatives. Tools left in fields overnight were exposed to weather and to possible taking by others, so daily transport was normal practice. The weight of tools and the distance to fields affected how tired workers became during each day of field work performed. Water for workers in fields was brought from dwelling areas in containers and was consumed throughout the workday as needed. The need for water increased during hot weather when physical exertion caused more rapid fluid loss through perspiration during work hours. Insufficient water consumption led to fatigue and reduced work capacity, so adequate supplies were brought and placed in shaded locations. Workers paused regularly to drink and to rest briefly before resuming work activities that continued until day's goals were met. Rest periods during field work happened at intervals determined by workers based on fatigue levels and on comfortable work rhythms established over time. These pauses allowed recovery of energy and provided opportunity for brief conversation or for assessment of work progress made so far. The duration and frequency of rest periods varied among individuals and were not standardized or enforced by external schedules or rules. Work resumed when individuals felt ready to continue rather than at predetermined times announced by any authority or timekeeper present. Meals eaten in fields during long work days were simple and consisted of foods that traveled well and required no preparation. Bread and dried foods were common choices because they did not spoil quickly in sun and did not require cooking before eating. These meals were consumed during extended rest periods that provided break from continuous physical labor performed otherwise throughout workday. The social aspect of shared meals in fields provided brief relief from solitary nature of much field work done individually. Weather affected the ability to work in fields and sometimes forced postponement of planned activities until conditions improved adequately for work. Rain made soil too muddy for effective work and made workers uncomfortable from being wet for extended periods without shelter. Extreme heat made sustained physical labor dangerous and less productive, so work was reduced or shifted to cooler parts of day. Cloud cover and mild temperatures provided most comfortable conditions for field work, but these conditions were not controllable by workers. Wind affected field work by making certain tasks more difficult and by affecting worker comfort during extended outdoor periods each day. Strong winds made it difficult to control plant materials during harvesting or during handling of lightweight materials used in various tasks. Dust raised by wind made breathing uncomfortable and reduced visibility when soil was dry and loose on field surfaces worked. Workers faced away from wind direction when possible during tasks that allowed choice of body orientation during work being performed. Seasonal progression through the year was marked by changes in field activities following predictable sequences repeated each cycle without variation. Preparation and planting were followed by growth periods requiring weeding and watering, followed by harvest and field clearing activities each year. The timing of these activities shifted slightly based on weather patterns, but the overall sequence remained constant across years and decades. Workers familiar with these patterns knew what activities would follow current work without need for explicit planning or announcement by anyone. Children who were old enough participated in field work alongside adults, learning tasks through observation and through gradual assumption of responsibilities over years. Their capacity for sustained work was less than adults, so their contributions were proportional to their developing strength and endurance. The presence of children in fields was normal during seasons when their labor contributed meaningfully to household work requirements being met. As children grew, their work capacity increased and they gradually took on more demanding tasks previously performed only by adults fully grown. Elderly people who could no longer perform heavy field labor contributed through lighter tasks or through supervision and instruction of younger workers. Their reduced physical capacity was accepted as a natural result of aging and did not diminish their position within household or community. The knowledge held by elderly people about land and techniques was valued and was shared with younger generations through conversation during. Their continued presence in fields, even in reduced capacity, maintained connection to work and to land they had cultivated over lifetimes. Injuries during field work resulted from accidents with tools or from physical strain beyond individual capacity at a particular moment in time. Minor injuries were treated with simple remedies applied immediately, and work continued unless injury prevented effective task performance after treatment applied. More serious injuries required stopping work and returning to dwelling for rest and for more extensive care if available from knowledge. Lost work time from injuries was made up by others or by injured person working longer on subsequent days after healing. Fatigue accumulated over days of continuous field work during demanding seasons and was relieved through rest days when no field. These rest periods allowed physical recovery and provided time for other household tasks that had been deferred during intensive field. The frequency of rest days varied based on work intensity and on cultural practices maintained within particular household or community groupings. No standard pattern existed across all households, so variation was normal and accepted as part of different approaches to organizing work. Paths between dwellings and other locations became more defined through repeated use over months and years of travel by people and animals. The surface of these paths was compacted from foot traffic and became harder and more resistant to plant growth than surrounding areas. During wet weather, these paths became muddy and water-pooled in low spots where drainage was insufficient to carry it away. Dry weather caused dust to accumulate on path surfaces, and this dust was stirred into air by passing feet and by wind. Maintenance of paths involved filling holes that developed from erosion and from concentrated water flow during rain events that occurred periodically. Soil or gravel was placed in depressions and was packed down by foot traffic that followed without need for additional work. Vegetation growing along path edges was cut back when it encroached too far into the traveled area, reducing usable width. These maintenance activities happened as needed rather than on predetermined schedules known in advance by all users of paths regularly. Bridges over small streams consisted of logs or stones placed to allow crossing without entering the water during normal flow conditions. These structures required inspection after heavy rains that might have shifted or damaged crossing materials used in their construction originally. Replacement of damaged bridge elements happened when existing structures no longer provided safe passage across water obstacles they spanned between banks. The same crossing locations were used for extended periods because suitable bridge sites were limited by terrain and by stream characteristics present. Fences constructed from wood or stone marked boundaries and contained animals in designated areas near dwellings and fields during all seasons. These structures required ongoing repair as posts rotted or as stones were displaced from their positions in fence lines over time. Gaps in fences allowed animal escape and required prompt repair to restore containment function that fences were intended to provide continuously. The materials for fence repairs were gathered from nearby sources as needed rather than being stockpiled in advance of actual need. Gates in fences provided controlled access through barriers and consisted of movable sections that could be opened and closed as needed. These gates were secured using simple latching mechanisms that prevented unintended opening by animals pushing against gate structures accidentally. Hinges made from leather or metal allowed gates to swing open while remaining attached at one edge to fence posts firmly. Worn hinges required replacement periodically to maintain smooth gate operation and to prevent sagging that interfered with opening and closing motions. Posts for fences and gates were set into ground by digging holes and placing posts upright before refilling with soil around them. The depth of holes affected stability of posts, especially in soft or sandy soils that provided less support than denser materials. Posts loosened over time as soil around them compacted or eroded and required resetting with fresh soil packed more firmly around bases. This maintenance was performed when posts showed visible lean or when they moved excessively when pushed by hand during inspections. Wooden fence rails connecting posts deteriorated from exposure to weather and from insect activity that weakened wood structure from inside outward gradually. Replacement of damaged rails happened when they broke or when they became too weak to provide effective barrier function between posts. New rails were cut to appropriate length and were attached to posts using methods that had been used for previous rails. The appearance of fences changed gradually as new wood was added during repairs while older weathered sections remained in place elsewhere. Stone fences required different maintenance than wooden fences but still needed periodic attention to maintain their barrier function across property boundaries. Stones became dislodged from frost action or from animals climbing over walls and needed to be repositioned to restore fence integrity. The skill in stacking stones without mortar developed through practice and observation of how stones fit together most stably in wall structures. Repairs to stone fences required selecting appropriate stones from available supplies and fitting them into gaps left by fallen or displaced stones. Ditches dug for drainage directed water away from dwellings and fields toward locations where standing water caused fewer problems for daily activities. These ditches filled gradually with soil carried by flowing water and with plant material that accumulated during growth seasons each year. Clearing of ditches restored their depth and capacity to carry water effectively during periods of heavy rainfall or snowmelt in spring. The removed material was placed along ditch banks where it built up low ridges parallel to ditch routes over many clearing cycles. Retaining walls made from stacked stones held soil in place on slopes and created level areas for buildings or for cultivation purposes. These walls required careful construction to remain stable under pressure from soil they retained behind their faces over long periods. Bulging or leaning in retaining walls indicated structural problems that needed attention before complete failure occurred and caused damage elsewhere. Repairs involved partially dismantling affected sections and rebuilding them with better stone selection and placement techniques used throughout the reconstruction work performed. Terraces on hillsides created flat growing areas from sloping ground and reduced erosion by slowing water movement down slopes during rainfall. The construction of terraces required moving substantial quantities of soil and building retaining walls at each terrace edge to hold reshaped ground. Maintenance of terraces involved repairing walls and replacing soil that had eroded from terrace surfaces over time despite reduced erosion rates. The effort invested in creating and maintaining terraces was justified by increased usable land area and improved growing conditions they provided. Steps cut into steep slopes or built from stones provided safer passage on terrain that was difficult to traverse otherwise on foot. These steps wore unevenly from repeated use and sometimes required rebuilding to restore even tread surfaces at consistent heights throughout runs. The location of steps was chosen to follow natural contours where possible to minimize construction effort required initially and for ongoing maintenance. Handrails or other supports were generally not provided, so users relied on careful foot placement and on balance during ascent and descent. Shade structures near work areas provided relief from direct sun during hot parts of day when outdoor work continued for extended hours. These structures consisted of posts supporting roofs made from plant materials or from fabric stretched across frames created for this purpose. The temporary nature of many shade structures meant they were constructed when needed and removed when no longer required for immediate use. More permanent shade structures near dwellings received maintenance similar to building maintenance to keep them functional across multiple seasons of use annually. Outdoor work surfaces including areas for food preparation or for craft activities were kept clear of debris and vegetation through regular sweeping. These surfaces accumulated leaves and dust and other wind-blown material that needed removal before surfaces could be used effectively for intended. The sweeping was performed as part of routine maintenance that prepared work areas for use rather than a separate activity scheduled independently. Clean work surfaces contributed to more efficient task performance and reduced contamination of foods or materials being processed in outdoor locations regularly. Sitting areas outside dwellings provided places for rest and for social interaction during pleasant weather when being outdoors was comfortable for people. These areas were kept clear and were sometimes furnished with logs or stones positioned to serve as seating during extended periods. The same locations were used repeatedly and became recognized as gathering spots where people would be found during certain times of day. Maintenance of these areas involved little more than keeping them clear and ensuring seating elements remained stable and comfortable for continued use. Storage areas outside dwellings held items that were too large or too numerous to keep inside limited interior spaces available within structures. These outdoor storage areas were positioned under overhangs or were covered to protect contents from direct rainfall and from excessive sun exposure. Items stored outdoors were generally those that were not damaged by temperature variations or by the higher humidity levels present outside buildings. Periodic reorganization of outdoor storage happened when access to specific items became difficult due to accumulated clutter blocking pathways to them regularly. Firewood storage required covered areas that allowed air circulation while protecting wood from direct rainfall that increased moisture content, making burning difficult. Stacked wood was arranged to promote drying through air movement between pieces while maintaining stability of stacks over time during storage. The oldest wood was used first while newer additions to storage dried further before their eventual use in fires for cooking. Rotation of wood supplies happened naturally through this system without requiring deliberate tracking of storage time for individual pieces used. Tool storage outside dwellings kept implements readily accessible for field work while protecting them somewhat from weather exposure between uses each day. Covered areas or simple sheds housed tools when they were not being transported to work locations for immediate use in. Ongoing tasks. Organization of tool storage allowed quick identification and retrieval of needed implements without searching through disorganized collections each time tools were required. The same storage locations were used consistently, so returning tools to proper places happened automatically through established habit patterns developed over extended time. Mornings began with the same sequence of actions performed in similar order day after day throughout all seasons of year. People moved from sleeping areas and began attending to fires and to other immediate needs that required attention before other activities. The transition from sleep to waking activity happened gradually as each person moved at their own pace through familiar routines established. No external schedule dictated the exact timing of these actions beyond the natural cycle of daylight beginning each day. Fire tending occupied the first portion of each morning as coals from the previous evening were stirred and fed with new fuel. The process of rebuilding fire from remaining coals was familiar and required little conscious attention from those who performed it regularly. Smoke from newly fed fires drifted through dwelling spaces before exiting through openings designed to allow its passage outward into morning air. The warmth from growing fires spread gradually through interior spaces as flames strengthened and consumed added fuel steadily over time. Water vessels were checked each morning to assess supplies remaining from previous day and to determine if additional water collection was needed. Empty or nearly empty vessels indicated that someone would need to make a trip to water sources during the morning hours. The person who went for water followed paths worn into the ground from countless previous trips made for this same purpose. Filled vessels were carried back and were placed in their usual locations where they would be accessed throughout the coming day. Food preparation for the first meal followed water collection or happened while water was being retrieved by someone else from the household. Grain or other food stored from previous preparations were brought out and were readied for cooking over fires that had been built up. The same preparation methods were used each morning with only minor variations based on what ingredients were most readily available at time. Cooking smells filled dwelling spaces as foods heated and transformed into forms suitable for eating by all household members present. Eating the morning meal happened when food preparation was completed and when household members had gathered in eating areas as usual. Portions were taken from shared vessels and were consumed without particular ceremony or extended conversation during the eating process itself regularly. The focus was on consuming prepared food rather than on social interaction that happened at other times throughout each day instead. Finished eating was indicated by individuals setting aside empty vessels and beginning to move toward other activities planned or expected for day. Cleanup from the morning meal was performed by those who remained near eating areas after others had departed to begin other tasks. Vessels were collected and were taken to washing areas where water and scrubbing removed food residues from surfaces of containers used. The cleaned items were set aside to dry while those who had done washing moved on to other work requiring attention. This pattern of meal preparation and cleanup repeated itself with each meal consumed throughout the day in similar fashion without variation. Movement to fields or to other work locations happened after morning tasks within dwelling had been completed by those responsible for them. Tools needed for the day were collected from storage areas and were carried along paths leading to work sites some distance away. The walk to fields provided time for bodies to fully waken and for minds to prepare for physical work that would occupy coming hours. Other household members remained near dwellings to attend to tasks that did not require traveling to distant locations for completion each day. Work in fields or gardens involved repetitive physical actions performed for extended periods with brief pauses for rest when needed by workers. The specific tasks varied with season and with stage of crop growth, but the general pattern of sustained physical effort remained constant. Hands moved through practiced motions that required little conscious direction from workers who had performed these same actions many times before throughout. Time passed steadily as work progressed and as the sun moved across the sky, indicating passage of morning into midday hours. Midday meals were sometimes eaten in fields when work locations were distant from dwellings and when returning for meal was impractical given distances involved. Food brought from dwelling in the morning was consumed during extended rest period that provided break from continuous work effort before then. The simple foods eaten during these field meals required no preparation beyond what had been done before departure from dwelling earlier. Water brought along was consumed to replace fluid lost through exertion and through perspiration during warm weather work periods extending through morning. Afternoon work resumed after midday rest and continued until diminishing daylight or until completion of planned tasks indicated appropriate stopping time for day. The same types of work actions continued as had occupied morning hours, but fatigue accumulated and made movements slower and less efficient. Workers assessed their own capacity and adjusted pace to maintain sustainable effort levels until work could reasonably be concluded for current day. The decision to stop work was made individually or collectively based on various factors considered in the moment without rigid rules. Return to dwellings in late afternoon involved gathering tools and walking back along the same paths used for morning departure from dwelling. The walk back was often quieter than morning departure as fatigue from day's work reduced conversation among those returning together from fields. Tools were returned to storage locations immediately or after cleaning if soil or plant material had accumulated on them during use. This completion of tool care ensured implements would be ready for use on following day without additional preparation required then. Evening meals required preparation similar to morning meals but often involved foods that needed longer cooking times to become ready for consumption. Fires were maintained or were built up again if they had been allowed to burn low during the day when not needed. The preparation work was divided among household members present and able to contribute to readiness of meal for all who would eat. Completed preparations led to serving and eating following patterns similar to those of other meals consumed throughout each day regularly. Conversation during evening hours was more extensive than at other times as people gathered near fires after days' work had ended completely. Topics of conversation included observations from the day and plans for coming days and other matters of immediate concern to household. These discussions happened naturally without formal structure and involved whoever was present and wished to participate in talking at time. The content of conversations was rarely memorable beyond immediate context and was generally forgotten soon after unless it concerned unusual events. Preparation for sleep began as evening conversations diminished and as individuals felt tiredness, indicating readiness for rest from day's activities performed. Movement to sleeping areas happened gradually as people withdrew from communal spaces near fires to locations designated for sleeping overnight each night. Fires were banked to burn slowly through night hours, providing some warmth and remaining as source for morning fire rebuilding when needed. The dwelling grew quieter as people settled into sleeping positions and as consciousness faded into sleep naturally and without resistance or delay. Night sounds included the crackling of burning wood and the occasional movement of people adjusting sleeping positions or attending to brief needs. Animals near the dwelling made periodic noises that were familiar and did not cause alarm among sleeping household members who heard them. Rain or wind outside created sounds that varied in volume and in pattern but were also familiar from long experience living. These night sounds formed a backdrop to sleep that was noticed only if something unusual or different occurred to draw attention briefly. Waking during night hours happened occasionally for various reasons, including need to tend to bodily functions or to check on children or animals. These brief wakings were followed by return to sleep without difficulty in most cases, as nothing prevented rest from continuing through remainder. The interrupted sleep did not usually cause significant fatigue on following day unless wakings were frequent or prolonged beyond brief duration needed. Most people slept through entire night periods without waking until morning light began to penetrate dwelling spaces and new day commenced once again. Days followed one another in succession, with each day resembling the previous one in most respects that mattered for daily routines. The pattern of waking and working and eating and sleeping repeated continuously without significant variation from one day to next during normal periods. Seasonal changes altered some specific tasks, but the underlying rhythm of daily activity remained consistent across all times of year. This consistency provided structure to life without requiring conscious planning or decision-making for most routine activities performed regularly by all. Work continued day after day, with the same tasks appearing repeatedly as crops grew or as maintenance needs arose again after recent attention. Fields required weeding that was never permanently completed because new weeds sprouted continuously throughout growing seasons despite previous removal efforts made. The repetitive nature of this work was accepted as normal condition rather than as problem requiring solution or as source of frustration. Hands moved through familiar motions of pulling and clearing without minds needing to direct each individual action taken during extended work periods. Tools were used and cleaned and stored and retrieved and used again in cycles that repeated without end throughout years of ownership. The same tools served the same purposes day after day until wear made them unusable and required replacement with new tools serving identical. Familiarity with each tool made its use automatic and allowed work to proceed smoothly without attention to mechanics of tool operation itself. Physical relationship between person and tool became established through repeated use until the tool felt like extension of the body during work. Food preparation involved the same ingredients combined in the same ways to produce meals that tasted familiar and expected to all who consumed. The specific combinations varied slightly based on what was available, but the general character of meals remained consistent across many years of preparation. No one expected meals to be particularly different from previous meals or to provide novelty beyond what seasonal availability naturally created over. The purpose of meals was sustenance rather than variety, and this purpose was adequately served by familiar preparations repeated continuously without change. Conversations between household members covered topics that had been discussed before in similar terms without much new information being added through repetition. Weather observations and work progress and plans for coming days formed the substance of most exchanges between people during the day. These conversations served to maintain connection between people rather than to convey important new information requiring attention or action by listeners involved. The content was less important than the act of speaking and hearing, which affirmed ongoing relationships among household members over time. Sleep each night was followed by waking each morning in continuous cycle that structured all other activities occurring during the intervening hours between. The quality of sleep varied somewhat but generally provided adequate rest for the physical demands of work performed during daylight hours regularly. Dreams occurred during sleep but were rarely remembered long enough to become topic of conversation or to influence waking thoughts in any lasting. The boundary between sleeping and waking was crossed twice daily in transition periods that required no particular effort or attention from those experiencing. Seasonal transitions happened gradually enough that no single day marked clear division between one season and the next in progression through year. Temperature changes and plant growth stages and animal behaviors indicated seasonal progression, but these changes accumulated slowly over many days of observation. Work tasks shifted to match seasonal needs without abrupt changes requiring adjustment or adaptation by those performing the work throughout each changing. The same seasonal cycle repeated each year following patterns that had been observed and experienced many times before by all household members. Weather varied from day to day within seasonal patterns that were generally predictable based on long observation of regional climate characteristics over time. Rain came and then ended and then came again in patterns that were familiar even if specific timing was uncertain in advance. Temperature fluctuations followed similar patterns with warm periods and cool periods alternating according to seasonal expectations that rarely surprised experienced observers closely. The weather affected comfort and work efficiency but did not typically prevent work from continuing in some form during most conditions encountered. Animals maintained their own routines that intersected with human routines at feeding times and at other moments requiring human attention to animal needs. The animals appeared at expected times and locations for feeding and showed little variation in their behavior from day to day normally. Their presence was a constant feature of daily life that required ongoing attention but not significant thought or planning beyond established routines already in place. Interactions with animals followed familiar patterns that had been established early and that continued without modification across long periods of shared existence. Children grew slowly enough that changes in their capabilities were not obvious from day to day but became apparent only over longer time spans. Their gradual assumption of more responsibilities happened without clear markers indicating transition from one stage to next in their development toward adulthood expected. Adults provided guidance and instruction, but much learning happened through observation and imitation rather than through explicit teaching moments deliberately created for purpose. The process of growing and learning extended over years and involved countless small increments of change accumulating into larger transformations eventually visible to all. Aging of adults proceeded similarly through small changes that accumulated but were not particularly noticeable in short-term observations made by those seeing. Physical capacity declined gradually and work roles shifted subtly to accommodate changing abilities without sudden transitions requiring announcement or formal recognition by others. The aged remained integrated into household activities at levels appropriate to their current capabilities rather than being separated or excluded from ongoing participation. Their presence and their knowledge continued to contribute value even as their physical contributions to heavy work diminished over passing years. Buildings and structures aged alongside their inhabitants through gradual accumulation of wear and through occasional damage events requiring repair interventions to restore function. The appearance of dwellings changed slowly as materials weathered and as repairs introduced new elements alongside old ones remaining in place still. No structure remained exactly as originally built for long, but changes accumulated slowly enough that the dwelling felt stable and familiar continuously. Maintenance efforts aimed at preserving function rather than at restoring original appearance, which was allowed to change naturally with time passing. Stored goods diminished through consumption and were replenished through production in cycles that maintained generally adequate supply levels across seasons and years. The balance between consumption and production was never perfect, but usually remained close enough to prevent serious shortage or excessive surplus accumulating over. Households aimed for sufficiency rather than abundance and generally achieved this modest goal through established practices maintained consistently over long periods. Occasional imbalances were addressed through adjustment of consumption rates or through increased production efforts in subsequent periods when possible to do so. Knowledge of how to perform various tasks was maintained through continuous practice rather than through formal instruction or through written records kept for reference later. Skills were preserved in bodies and minds of practitioners who used them regularly enough to maintain proficiency without deliberate practice efforts beyond normal work. Techniques were passed to younger generation through demonstration and supervised participation rather than through explanation separated from actual task performance in context needed. This transmission of knowledge happened continuously as older and younger people worked together on shared tasks requiring coordination and cooperation between them. Social relationships within households remained relatively stable, with the same people occupying the same positions relative to each other across extended time. Conflicts occurred occasionally but were generally resolved through discussion or through passage of time that allowed tensions to dissipate without formal intervention required. The stability of relationships provided predictable social environment within which daily activities could proceed without uncertainty about expectations or about responses from. People knew each other well enough that communication could be minimal because shared understanding developed through long association together in shared space. Community relationships beyond immediate household followed similar patterns of stability, with the same neighboring households occupying same positions in social network across years. Interactions happened at predictable times and places and followed familiar patterns that required little negotiation or explanation between parties who had engaged. Mutual assistance during periods of need was expected and was generally provided without requiring explicit request or without creating obligation requiring formal repayment. The informal reciprocity maintained balance over time even if individual exchanges were not precisely equal in immediate sense at moment occurring. Tasks were performed and then were performed again as each completion created conditions requiring the same task to be performed again later. Grain was ground into flour and flour was consumed in meals, and then more grain needed grinding to produce flour for subsequent meals. The cycle repeated without variation in basic pattern even as specific days and specific batches of grain passed through the process continuously. Each completion led directly to next beginning without pause between them that would mark definite ending or definite starting of anything particularly. Water was carried from sources to dwelling and was used, and then more water needed carrying to replace what had been consumed or used. The same paths were walked repeatedly with full containers on the journey to dwelling and with empty containers on the return journey. Each trip was distinct from previous trips only in minor details that were rarely noticed or remembered by those who made the journeys. The necessity of the task ensured its continuation without requiring decision about whether it should be done at any particular moment when. Fires were built and burned and produced ash that was removed to make space for new fires to be built in the same locations. The process of building and burning and clearing repeated in continuous sequence without final completion that would end the need for fire maintenance. Each fire was similar to fires that had burned before and to fires that would burn afterward in the same fire pit. The warmth and light provided by fires served immediate needs without creating lasting change in conditions that necessitated fire building regularly again. Clothes were worn and became soiled and were washed and dried and worn again in cycles that continued as long as garments remained intact. The same pieces moved through these stages repeatedly until fabric wore through and required repair to extend usability for additional cycles of use. Eventually, even repaired garments reached states where continued use was impractical, and they were replaced with new garments that entered the same cycles. The process continued with different garments occupying the same functional positions in the ongoing sequence of wearing and washing performed by all. Meals were prepared and eaten, and the vessels were cleaned, and then the same vessels were used to prepare and serve subsequent meals consumed. The repetition of meal cycles structured each day into segments divided by eating periods that occurred at similar times daily normally. Food moved from storage to preparation to consumption to waste in flows that continued steadily as long as stored food supplies lasted. When storage was depleted, new supplies entered storage, and the flow continued without interruption beyond what was required for harvest and processing activities. Sleep was entered and then was exited and then was entered again in alternating states that followed one another in regular succession without end. Each period of sleep was similar to previous sleep periods in most respects that could be noticed by those who slept through them. Waking provided opportunity for activity, and then sleep provided rest from activity in balanced rhythm that maintained itself across all days and seasons. The necessity of both states ensured their continuation without either state being preferred over the other in any fundamental way that mattered. Days transitioned into nights and nights transitioned into days as light levels changed following patterns determined by movements beyond human control or influence directly. The regularity of these transitions provided temporal structure that organized activity without requiring conscious attention to passage of time in most circumstances. People responded to changing light levels naturally by adjusting their activities to match what could be effectively accomplished under prevailing conditions at any moment. The transitions themselves were not events but were gradual changes that happened continuously rather than at specific instants clearly marked by anything observable. Seasonal changes proceeded through familiar progressions that had been observed countless times before by all who experienced them during current cycle. Temperature patterns and plant growth stages and animal behavior shifted gradually from one seasonal state toward next seasonal state in continuous transformation. No particular moment marked transition between seasons definitively, even though general periods were recognized as belonging to one season or another broadly. The changes created variations in specific tasks performed but did not alter fundamental patterns of daily activity that continued regardless of season currently. Years followed one another in succession, with each year containing the same seasonal cycle experienced during previous years in similar order and with similar characteristics. Differences between years existed in details of weather patterns and crop yields and other variables, but overall structure remained consistent across. The passage of years was marked more by accumulation of small changes in people and in structures than by any events that clearly distinguished. Time passage was experienced through gradual transformation rather than through discrete moments that separated before from after in memorable ways for those involved. Generations succeeded one another as older people aged and as younger people grew and eventually produced their own children who would continue patterns forward. The transmission of knowledge and practices from older to younger happened continuously through shared work and shared living rather than through formal instruction. Each generation learned the same basic tasks and performed them using the same basic methods that previous generations had used before them. Changes in technique were minor and were adopted slowly if at all, so that continuity was maintained across generational transitions occurring naturally over time. Dwellings sheltered successive groups of inhabitants as original occupants aged and were eventually replaced by those who came after in continuous occupation. The structures themselves changed gradually through ongoing maintenance and through incremental modifications made to address emerging needs or problems encountered over years. But the basic function of providing shelter remained constant, and the physical space continued to serve this purpose without fundamental transformation. Each group of occupants used the dwelling in ways similar to previous occupants even as specific individuals changed over extended time periods. Fields produced crops season after season, with each harvest being followed by preparation for next planting cycle that would produce next harvest eventually. The land continued to support growth when properly maintained and when seasonal conditions allowed plant development to proceed toward maturity and toward harvest. Some years produced better yields than other years, but the overall capacity of land remained relatively stable across many growing seasons experienced. The relationship between land and people who worked it continued without major disruption as long as maintenance practices were sustained adequately over time. Tools served their functions repeatedly until wear or breakage required their replacement, with similar tools serving the same functions going forward after replacement. The specific implements changed, but the functions they served remained constant, and new tools were selected or made to match capabilities of tools. No innovation in tool design occurred that would have altered fundamental nature of work performed using the tools regularly during tasks. The continuation of familiar tool types ensured that skills learned in using one tool remained applicable when using replacement tools obtained afterward when needed. Storage areas held materials that were used and then were replenished when new materials became available from production or gathering activities performed. The cycle of depletion and replenishment continued as consumption proceeded at rates roughly matched by production rates sustained over longer time spans. The same storage locations held materials repeatedly, with specific items changing but general categories of stored goods remaining consistent across seasons. Organization of storage reflected ongoing needs rather than reflecting any particular planning for future needs different from current needs being experienced now. Paths continued to serve as routes between locations, with the same paths being traveled repeatedly by people moving between dwelling and fields and water. The surfaces of paths changed through wear and through weathering, but the routes remained the same, following terrain features that made these paths most practical. Maintenance kept paths usable without making them fundamentally different from how they had been previously when serving the same transportation purposes. The paths connected the same locations year after year, even as specific individuals using them changed over longer time periods, passing gradually. Maintenance work continued without reaching final completed state because all maintained items required ongoing attention to preserve their function adequately over time. Each maintenance action addressed immediate needs but created conditions that would require future maintenance in recurring patterns extending indefinitely forward. The work of maintaining was never finished but was only current until next attention was needed at some point ahead in time. This ongoing nature of maintenance meant that work continued without pause for celebration of completion, since completion never actually occurred in any final sense. Activities continued in established patterns that had developed over long periods of repetition and that showed no signs of approaching any conclusion or transformation. Each day's activities prepared conditions for next day's activities in continuous flow that extended from past into future without boundaries marking where one unit. The sameness of this continuation provided stability and predictability that made conscious planning unnecessary for most routine matters that comprised daily existence. Things continued as they had continued before and as they would continue afterward in patterns maintained through simple repetition across all time.